Imagine turning yourself in to the FBI and somehow ending up in charge of the room. Not through force, not through threats, but through information. Raymond Reddington doesn't survive because he's invisible. He survives because he understands something most people don't. Power doesn't live in secrecy. It lives in systems that don't know how to stop once they start moving. This video isn't about how clever Red is. It's about how close everything came to collapsing, again and again, and why it didn't. Because every time Reddington almost got caught, what actually saved him wasn't luck. It was hesitation, procedure, and people mistaking cooperation for control. Turning himself in. The most dangerous first move. Reddington's first and most obvious near failure is also his boldest. Surrendering to the FBI. This wasn't immunity. This wasn't protection. This was exposure. The danger wasn't arrest. That was guaranteed. The danger was loss of leverage. The pressure point was simple. If the FBI treated him like a criminal instead of an asset, his entire strategy collapsed before it began. What saved him wasn't charm. It was timing. He arrived with a blacklist the Bureau couldn't ignore, and information they couldn't independently verify. The system didn't have a framework for someone who was both the threat and the solution. Deeper meaning. Institutions don't respond to truth. They respond to utility. What if? If the FBI had separated intelligence intake from criminal custody, even briefly, Red would have lost his bargaining chip. No blacklist, no leverage, no seat at the table. Just a prisoner with stories. The gamble within the gamble. But there's another layer beneath this calculated surrender. Reddington wasn't merely betting on bureaucratic inefficiency. He was engineering a paradox the government couldn't solve. Every intelligence agency operates on hierarchy. Every hierarchy requires categorization, and Red defied categorization. He wasn't a defector seeking asylum. He wasn't an informant bargaining for leniency. He was a criminal demanding partnership. That unprecedented position created paralysis. The moment FBI leadership began debating how to classify him, they'd already lost the initiative. While committees formed and protocols were drafted, Reddington was embedding himself into operational necessity, the hidden vulnerability. His entire approach hinged on speed, specifically delivering actionable intelligence before institutional wheels could turn against him. Each name on the blacklist bought him time. Each capture postponed scrutiny. Secondary, what if? What if his first target had been unreachable or already dead? The credibility gap would have widened just enough for skepticism to harden into protocol. One failed lead in those critical first weeks, and suddenly he's not an asset. He's a liability awaiting processing. Elizabeth Keene, the liability. He couldn't control. Elizabeth Keene was never just an asset. She was the risk Reddington chose anyway. The danger wasn't her curiosity. It was her proximity. She sat at the intersection of evidence, emotion, and authority. And unlike everyone else, she wasn't predictable. The pressure point came whenever Liz stopped asking what and started asking why. Reddington survived these moments by doing something counterintuitive. He never fully denied her. He delayed her. Partial truths, redirected focus, emotional fog. Deeper meaning. Control doesn't mean answers, it means pacing. What if? If Liz had ever documented her suspicions formally, even once, the system would have been forced to act. Internal review, independent task force, oversight. And suddenly, Red's ambiguity becomes evidence. The emotional architecture. Reddington's relationship with Keene reveals something most operatives never acknowledge. Sentiment creates vectors of attack that logic cannot defend against. Every conversation carried dual risk. Every gesture implied history. Every silence suggested secrets worth uncovering. He couldn't simply eliminate the threat. She was integrated too deeply into the apparatus he needed. Nor could he fully satisfy her questions. Transparency would have triggered investigations he couldn't survive. So he weaponized ambiguity itself. The manipulation was architectural. Feed enough truth to validate her instincts. withhold enough context to prevent conclusions, create emotional dependency that delays logical investigation. But this strategy contained its own countdown. Human beings don't tolerate uncertainty indefinitely. Eventually, unanswered questions transform from curiosity into obsession, then into mission. The real danger, not what Liz might discover, but when she'd stop asking him and start asking others. The moment her investigation became independent, his narrative control evaporated. What if Liz had formed an alliance with just one person Red couldn't monitor? A therapist, a journalist, an old friend outside the bureau? External documentation, separate from the task force ecosystem, would have created a parallel investigation he couldn't shape or suppress. The task force, trust as a blind spot. The FBI task force believed they were managing Reddington. That belief was the risk. The danger wasn't corruption, it was normalization. Red became routine. The pressure point arrived when his patterns became familiar instead of alarming. He survived by being useful often enough that questioning him felt inefficient. Deeper meaning. The moment something becomes routine, it stops being scrutinized. If even one rotating commander had audited Red's involvement fresh, without history or emotional buy-in, the inconsistencies would have stacked up fast. And systems do act when inconsistencies are written down. Institutional Stockholm Syndrome. What happened to the task force wasn't partnership. It was gradual capture. Each successful operation created investment. Each crisis he resolved generated dependency. Each insight he provided became indispensable. This wasn't manipulation through deception. This was manipulation through productivity. Reddington understood something fundamental about organizations. They optimize for performance, not principle. Once a resource proves consistently valuable, questioning that resource becomes politically costly. The invisible threat. Not individual suspicion, but institutional audit. One person doubting Red could be isolated, discredited, or reassigned. But a systematic review, triggered by rotation, oversight requirement, or external investigation, would reveal the cumulative pattern his usefulness had obscured. The numbers would tell stories people had stopped asking about. How many operations depended solely on his intelligence? How many targets conveniently eliminated rivals to his interests? How many task force members now had careers built on cases he'd delivered? What if budget constraints had forced a formal cost-benefit analysis of the task force's existence? Financial scrutiny reveals operational dependencies that personal relationships obscure. The moment someone calculated the resource allocation versus conviction rate, uncomfortable questions would have emerged about who was serving whom. Criminal rivals. When reputation almost failed, Reddington's criminal network depends on fear and credibility. That's fragile. Every rival who tested him wasn't just a threat. They were a referendum on his myth. The pressure point wasn't violence. It was exposure. Red survived by responding disproportionately and selectively. He never defended his reputation publicly. He erased doubt privately. Deeper meaning, power isn't maintained by being seen. It's maintained by being remembered. What if? If one rival had lived long enough to speak, or worse, testify, the myth fractures. And once fear becomes negotiable, leverage evaporates. The economics of terror. Criminal ecosystems operate on information asymmetry. The less people know about your actual capabilities, the more they assume. Reddington's genius wasn't violence. Plenty of criminals are violent. His genius was mystique management. Every confrontation was theater designed for an audience of thousands who'd never witness it directly. The strategy had three components. Overwhelming response. When challenged, retaliate so disproportionately that observers overestimate your resources. Strategic silence. Never explain. Explanation suggests justification. Justification implies you're subject to judgment. Proxy amplification. Let others tell your stories. Secondhand accounts grow in the telling, and legend serves better than fact. But this approach contained a critical vulnerability. It required perfect execution. One botched response, One visible weakness, one survivor with a contradictory narrative, and the entire edifice of fear begins cracking. The compounding risk. Each successful intimidation raised the stakes for the next. Rivals weren't testing his strength, they were testing his consistency. The moment his response fell short of his reputation, every postponed challenge would activate simultaneously. Fifth, what if? What if social media and encrypted communications had existed earlier in his career? The ability for rivals to coordinate, compare notes, and collectively pressure test his mythology would have collapsed the information asymmetry his power required. You can't maintain mystery when 12 people are live tweeting your limitations. Paper trails, the enemy he respected. Most guns don't scare Reddington. Documents do. Every financial transaction, every shell company, every favor logged was a quiet threat. The pressure point came whenever systems overlapped. Banks, courts, intelligence agencies. He survived through compartmentalization, not secrecy. No single record ever told the whole story. Deeper meaning. Systems fail, not because they lack data, but because data isn't shared cleanly. What if? If interagency cooperation had been efficient instead of political, Red's structure collapses under its own complexity. The mathematics of obscurity. Reddington understood something most criminals miss. You can't operate without leaving traces, so the solution isn't invisibility, it's incomprehensibility. His approach was architectural. Create so many entities that mapping relationships requires resources investigators don't have. Distribute transactions across jurisdictions that don't communicate efficiently. Layer legitimate business with criminal enterprise until distinguishing them requires expertise that spans multiple specialties. Time operations so that by the time patterns emerge, key evidence has aged past investigative priority. The beautiful horror of this strategy. It works by weaponizing bureaucratic inefficiency. He wasn't hiding from the system. He was hiding inside it, using its own complexity as camouflage. But digital integration threatened everything. The technological risk. Databases that once required manual cross-referencing were beginning to interconnect. Pattern recognition algorithms were replacing human analysis. Transaction monitoring was becoming automated and instantaneous. Each technological advancement narrowed the gap his strategy exploited. What if? What if financial regulators had implemented blockchain-based tracking even 5 years earlier? Immutable, instantaneous, globally accessible transaction records would have eliminated the jurisdictional and temporal gaps his structure required. You can't compartmentalize what's universally transparent. Medical vulnerability, mortality as exposure illness, stripped Reddington of the one thing he always relied on: control. The danger wasn't death, it was dependence. Hospitals, doctors, records, systems he didn't own. He survived by turning vulnerability into misdirection, letting others underestimate how much time he had left. Deeper meaning. The body is the one system you can't fully corrupt. What if? If a single physician had treated him as a patient instead of a mystery, confidentiality gives way to reporting, and the curtain lifts fast. The biology of secrecy. Physical deterioration doesn't negotiate. It doesn't accept bribes. It doesn't respect strategy. For someone whose entire existence depended on calculated presentation, illness represented an uncontrollable variable. The exposure came in layers. Medical records contain identity markers, DNA, fingerprints through handling, photographic documentation. Treatment requires trust. You cannot simultaneously hide from and depend on healthcare professionals. If two betrayals had overlapped, even briefly, Red wouldn't have been outplayed. He would have been overwhelmed. The calculus of Alliance. Reddington never believed in loyalty. He believed in aligned incentives. Every relationship operated on a formula. Provide enough value that betrayal seems unprofitable. Maintain enough leverage that betrayal seems dangerous. Create enough dependency that betrayal seems impractical. Keep enough distance that betrayal can't be immediately catastrophic. But humans are not equations. Emotions override calculations. Grudges accumulate interest. Opportunities appear unexpectedly. The structural vulnerability, His network was decentralized by necessity. No single person knew enough to destroy him. But decentralization creates coordination costs. The more distributed his operations, the more points of potential failure. Each trusted associate was simultaneously essential and dangerous. Essential because specialization increases efficiency. Dangerous because specialization creates irreplaceable knowledge. The timing problem. He could manage betrayals sequentially. Isolate the threat, neutralize the damage, rebuild the gap. But simultaneous betrayals would fragment his attention, compound his vulnerabilities, and eliminate his ability to control narrative. What if two betrayers had communicated with each other before acting? Coordinated defection eliminates his standard response of playing sides against each other. Two people with partial information, comparing notes, suddenly have comprehensive information. Two people timing their exposure simultaneously create a credibility that one person's testimony lacks. The math of betrayal changes entirely when traitors collaborate. The FBI's biggest miss: mistaking access for control. This is the closest Reddington ever came to truly being caught. Not arrested, neutralized. The FBI believed proximity meant dominance. They had him in the building, on the record, under watch, and that's exactly why they failed. Deeper meaning. Power doesn't disappear when it's supervised. It adapts. What if? If the Bureau had treated Red as a systemic threat instead of a cooperative asset, containment replaces collaboration. And collaboration is where he thrives. The illusion of custody. The FBI's fundamental error was philosophical, not operational. They thought they were managing a source. They were actually hosting an infiltration. Every moment Reddington spent in FBI custody, he was observing protocols and identifying exploitable gaps, building relationships with personnel across departments, gaining insight into active investigations beyond his task force, establishing presence as normal, making his absence eventually notable and concerning, creating institutional dependency on his cooperation. The Bureau operated on a containment model. Keep him close, monitor his movements, control his communications. But containment assumes the threat is trying to escape. Reddington was never trying to leave. He was trying to embed. The access he gained wasn't about physical presence. It was about cognitive space. He became part of how the FBI thought about criminal enterprise. His perspective shaped threat assessments. His intelligence influenced resource allocation. His cooperation set precedents for how the Bureau engaged with high-value criminal sources. The most dangerous infiltration, not of buildings or databases, but of institutional culture. He changed what was considered normal, acceptable, negotiable. Ninth, what if? What if the FBI had implemented a strict rotation policy? No agent works with Reddington for more than 6 months. No exceptions. Fresh eyes every 2 quarters would have prevented the normalization of his presence. Each new handler would document inconsistencies their predecessor had stopped noticing. The institutional memory would record patterns that personal familiarity had begun excusing. Rotation prevents capture, and Red's entire strategy depended on capture, just slower and subtler than anyone recognized. Conclusion: the architecture of almost Reddington's career is a masterclass not in avoiding failure, but in managing proximity to it. He never achieved security. He maintained tolerable instability. Each near miss revealed the same pattern. His survival depended on exploiting the gap between what systems could theoretically do and what they actually did in practice. Bureaucratic friction, human error, institutional silos, resource constraints, political incentives, technological lag. These weren't advantages he possessed. They were conditions he cultivated. The moment any system operated at its theoretical capacity, perfect information sharing, efficient coordination, consistent application of protocol, his structure would collapse. He didn't beat the system. He bet the system would beat itself. And for years, that bet paid. Until it didn't. Because the one thing he couldn't control was evolution, both technological and institutional. Systems learn. gaps narrow, anomalies get categorized. The question was never whether he'd be caught. The question was whether he'd accomplish his objectives before the window closed. And that's the final near failure, racing his own expiration date. Outro. The real reason. Red survived. Raymond Reddington didn't survive because he was smarter than everyone else. He survived because systems hesitated, people personalized him, and institutions mistook usefulness for control. Luck didn't save him. Structure did. If you enjoyed this breakdown, you already know what to do. And if you want to see how close other characters came to collapse, check out the next one. Because the most dangerous moment isn't when everything goes wrong. It's when everything almost does, and nobody notices.